Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another Sheffield DM. I hope everyone's ready to enjoy the Easter weekend. I know that I certainly am. Having a couple of 4-day weeks is going to be awesome. I'm really looking forward to heading back to the barbers too when they reopen, so I don't have to hide my mop with this hat anymore. And you all get to see a lovely sharp cut next time. This is our fourth Lunch and Learn of 2021, and we've been absolutely loving running them so far. If you don't know me, I'm your host, Giorgio, and I'm the head of marketing at Evoluted, who are the sponsors of Sheffield DM. And this week, we're joined by Stephen Spiewak. Stephen is a digital content senior manager at Vivid Seats, a ticket marketplace based out in Chicago. So right now, I think it's about 6:30 a.m. over there. So I'm super grateful for Stephen getting up really early to deliver a talk today. Stephen's going to be sharing his experience about how brands can leverage their internal data to aid creative storytelling in their PR campaigns. And it's going to be such an interesting topic. So make sure you sat down, make sure you're comfy, get your lunch ready, grab a cup of tea, because we're going to be in for a real treat today. So without further ado, good morning, Stephen. Let's bring you in.
Morning or good afternoon. Thanks for having me,
Good morning to you. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Excited to chat today.
Brilliant. I understand the weather's been a bit up and down over in Chicago at the moment. I mean, we're British, we can't help but talk about the weather, but I think you mentioned that it's hitting the minuses at the moment in terms of Celsius anyway.
Thankfully, minus in Celsius, but about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which is still very unpleasant for what is now April.
Stay wrapped up warm inside. I can't imagine it's much fun at 6:30 in the morning either. So thank you ever so much for your time.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed that my Rottweiler puppy is content settling back in for a little post-breakfast nap.
Bless. I'm sure if they need a little bit of fuss, nobody on the stream is going to mind. I'm not going to ramble too much longer. I know that we're on a time limit today to keep everybody sorted out during their lunch hour. So I'm going to pass it over to you, and I will see you on the other side. For everybody who's watching, as usual, if you want to ask any questions, pop them in the chat over on YouTube Live, and we'll go through them all at the end. Over to you, Stephen.
All right. Are we good on my screen? Cool. All right. So internal data. So a little bit about me. I work for ticket marketplace Vivid Seats, and we have had a lot of success and a lot of fun telling data-driven stories. So traditionally, ticket companies like us have been in the press around stories about ticket price. And we have had a great deal of kind of fun telling stories that are a little bit more in-depth than ticket price. And so we data-driven storytelling, data-driven PR is something we have a lot of fun with and something that we take a lot of pride in. And I'm excited to share a little bit about, I think, kind of best practices on both sides of the data PR spectrum, in-house, brand, agency. So what are we even talking about with internal data? So on the bottom left there, we have a Spotify Wrapped slide, which I think is the gold standard really in data-driven PR for a brand. But internal data, any data that the business is already tracking and analyzing for its non-external and PR operations. So things like sales, things like site traffic, things like user behavior, really anything that the business is analyzing and studying for the sake of the business, for the sake of business success, not necessarily PR success, right? So data points, spreadsheets, files that the business is using on a day-to-day basis that could potentially have some really potent PR storytelling if you're able to access it, if you're able to understand it. So things that are already at the brand, at the company, that you can maybe use in a PR manner. So nothing new, not a new survey, not a new data set, but data that the company already has that you are able to leverage on the PR front. So just a couple of quick examples of data-driven PR. I really like this one from a smart mattress company. The Minnesota Vikings is an NFL football team, and they worked with a company called Sleep Number that is able to track user sleep. And they told this really interesting story that they shared on social, that following a big Minnesota Vikings football game, 61% of people in Minnesota stayed up later than a normal Sunday night. So really fun, really sexy stat that played well on social and really told the story of more than just mattresses, but told the story of the excitement of an entire city. And now Sleep Number brand is tied into that really interesting story, really exciting moment in the city. And their brand is front and center in that moment because they were willing, able, equipped to tell a story with their own internal data. So had they not shared that internal data, no one ever would have known that. And so I think this is a really fun example of a brand using their data for fun storytelling. Grubhub is a food delivery app here in the US, and they do a really good job of telling data stories through the lens of their order data. So they do a big year in review every year, and last year they got a lot of press around analyzing the data for the different orders. So they realized that Americans had a unusual pizza craving in 2020. So Americans more often than usual, I guess, we're ordering pizza puffs. Now, I'm not entirely sure what pizza puffs are, but it made headlines, and it was an interesting way to understand how people were consuming and ordering food in a pandemic when we can't just go to a restaurant as easily. So that was another interesting example that I liked. And then finally, as a way to demonstrate that the brands that are winning with data-driven storytelling are not simply the young, innovative, flashy brands. Uhaul is a brand that is over 70 years old, and they do shipping and moving. So if you are moving from one city to another, the odds are you are renting a U-Haul truck, loading up all your stuff, buying your friend's pizza as a thank you for helping you move. It's a very unsexy industry, but they've had a lot of success telling stories through the lens of their data. So they had a migration report in 2020 that explored their moving data and helped tell the story of where people are moving to, where people are moving from, which cities are growing, which cities are shrinking. And I talked to Uhaul about this because I was really impressed with it. And they said so many people are interested in our data. Businesses, real estate people, college professors, college students, all these people that are looking to use shipping and moving data to tell a bigger story and a bigger picture. And I just, in my mind, I'm thinking, you know, the link opportunities, if your data is helping college professors, college students, right? There's a lot of opportunity there. And again, this is a company that is not a super flashy, new, innovative industry. This is a behemoth in a very old industry, and they're having a lot of success with data-driven storytelling. So one thing that I think is really important to point out, when you're telling stories with data, the brand takes a back seat. So when I'm talking about data internally, I tell people that our data is a lens through which we can interpret, explain, or understand some bigger phenomenon, right? So our data is helping bring into focus some larger cultural, societal trend that otherwise might not have ever been kind of brought to light, save not for our data. So I have this kind of image here where the data is the lens and the story is kind of what comes into focus. But this is very different, I think, than sort of product-led marketing. This is not, you're not going to get your CEO in an interview as a, kind of feature story, feature profile. You will kind of take a back seat to whatever that bigger story is, but your data can bring that story into focus. And I think that there's a lot of value in that. And some of those benefits of data-driven PR, because I do think it is a massive opportunity. The first one is that it's highly relevant, right? So if you're telling a story with the help of your data and you find some interesting trend in your company's data, it's very difficult for whatever story that leads to not be relevant for your brand because your data is playing a role in telling that story. So I think we've all seen campaigns that were interesting, they were successful, they earned links, they earned coverage, But you kind of take a step back and you think, well, wait a minute. Yeah, that's a cool story. That's a cool campaign. But what did that really have to do with the brand that ran it, right? When you're using your data as part of your PR, there's always that natural connection. You can't stray too far from relevance if your data is a part of the story. Secondly, being authoritative is another perk, I think, of data-driven storytelling. People love data. The media love data. I think in the US especially, we just had an election year. Data was front and center in all the political coverage. Certainly on the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, where data storytelling and data visualizations helped us understand these crazy things that were happening in our world. I think that people are more equipped than ever to understand stories with data. And I think data continues to give brands authority. So in that Uhaul example, where they were helping to understand stories of migration data and migration patterns, the fact that they were producing data that got picked up in all of these prominent outlets, like, hey, Uhaul is the authority on anything moving. People are coming and going. You think Uhaul, you don't think anyone else. So there's that nice kind of authoritative component to leveraging your data in that way. And then data can help you tell unique stories. We all know these campaigns that have been done to death, Google Trends data, most Instagrammable this, right? Your data may not be entirely unique. There may be other companies and other brands that have similar data sets, but I guarantee you, if you're starting with your own data and not Google Trends, Google AdWords data, the odds of your final story and your finished product being much more unique, I think are really high. So it gives you something that other brands don't have. It gives you a hook that other brands don't have, because that data set is not available publicly. And as data journalists become more popular and more prominent in different news publications, I think they're looking and they're hungry for new and interesting data sets, data stories. So you can have a unique data set that they can't find in any public database of data sets. And finally, I think data-driven storytelling is a nice survey alternative. So I think surveys are another way that brands tell stories with data when they don't have or use internal data. And if you're able to do that, you can avoid surveys, which can be very, very expensive at times. And I think not always credible in the eyes of journalists, right? So I think that the pushback that journalists have when they see survey data is, this was sponsored by a brand, these results may not be credible. It's not impossible to do surveys well, but I think being able to tell stories with your own data is kind of a nice tool to have. And so when you are at a brand and you are looking to tell stories with data, or you're at an agency and you're looking to work with that brand to kind of tease out some of that internal data, I think the hurdles are pretty much the same. So the first challenge that you need to overcome and understand is data sensitivity. So not all companies are big public companies with a full financial history that's available for anyone who wants to see it. And you need to understand that not everyone is comfortable with, having their data out in the public. And so, how can you tell stories that still respect the privacy and the sensitivity of your company's data? So maybe you have a great story angle that says, oh, our company did 10 million pounds of business this year. Isn't that great? Well, maybe the company is not super excited to have their data out in the public like that. So that's kind of the first thing. You need to understand what the company, what the brand, what your data people are comfortable with. And kind of along those lines, the idea of competitive advantage. So if you are telling a story that is so interesting and so unique and so surprising that it's going to be this massive PR success, you may have to kind of understand that, well, maybe your company is doing something so unique and so surprising and so unexpected that, sure, it's a great PR story, but if you put it out in the press and all of your competitors come to understand what you're doing and how you're doing it, you may compromise some of your company's competitive advantage. These are typically not like huge issues, but it is something to consider that, if you have like some secret sauce company, thing going on at your company or your brand, and you want to tell the world about it because it's such an interesting story, you just need to be aware that if you tell it, your competitors are going to learn about it too. And customer privacy is another issue that you need to consider. You don't want to expose or compromise your customers in any way. And then logistics of who's retrieving the data. So it's probably not you. If you're the PR in your company, if you're the rep at an agency, you are probably not the one who is going to be hands-on pulling the data. So how do you get access to that data to tell those stories? And so I put together a slide of some do's and don'ts that help address how to overcome some issues around data sensitivity. So in general, raw data, number of sales, number of orders, amount of revenue, raw number of site visitors. These are all things that are typically very sensitive. So if you ask your company or your data folks, hey, I want to tell this story, can you give me the raw number of sales that we had this year? They would probably say, why would we ever share that? That's very sensitive information. So in general, you want to move away from just anything where it's an actual dollar sign, an actual number of orders, an actual number of sales. And you want to look at things like share percentages and geographical components. So if I run an ice cream shop, I may not want to say, hey, these are the number of ice cream cones that I sold in the summer of 2020. But maybe I can tell a story around, hey, in the summer of 2019, we had 20% of our sales for strawberry ice cream and 80% for chocolate and vanilla. But in the previous year, maybe it was 80% strawberry and 10% chocolate and vanilla. So you're not revealing any raw numbers, but you're still potentially telling a similar story with the data in a way that better respects the privacy of the company. Percentage increase and decrease. So this is where you look at trends in your data. Do you have a spike in a certain ice cream flavor sale? Hey, sales are up 20% in strawberry. Sales are down 10% in vanilla. And geography, I think, is another really safe and interesting way to sort of frame the data. So again, rather than, hey, we sold X number of chocolate ice cream cones, Y number of vanilla ice cream cones, something along the lines of, hey, this is the top selling ice cream flavor in every state. And so this slide is on respecting the business, both kind of the competitive advantage side of it and the customers. So this was a front page story in my local newspaper a few days ago, March 31st. Chain of Lakes boat dealers see high demand, short supply as pandemic purchases continue. So ostensibly, this is a story about boat dealers and boat sales, but kind of getting back to that lens idea, this is really a story about the return of summer, people itching to get out of the pandemic, people wanting to get back to normal, and it's through the lens of boat sales. But in terms of respecting the business, you may find a really interesting story where, hey, people that are buying the most boats actually don't live near lakes. They live in really wealthy communities that are more than 60 miles away from the lake. And that could be an interesting story. But if you tell this great big story around, hey, people buying boats are not living near lakes, they're actually living in these very small, very wealthy communities, well, all of your competitors are going to begin to ramp up their advertising in those very same markets and potentially begin to eat into your share of those very lucrative boat selling markets. So that's something that you need to consider, is that this could be a really cool story, but it may not be worth, kind of compromising the business advantage. And on the customer front, perhaps you're selling boats, or your brand is selling boats, and you have a really interesting story because one customer bought 10 boats in 1 year. That's interesting. Wow, what's he doing with all those boats? How much does it cost for all of his fuel? Does he travel in those boats? Where is he storing all those boats? There's a lot to it. It's interesting. It's kind of an eye-catching number. Well, maybe that person who bought all those boats doesn't really want people to know that he owns 10 boats. And if you say, oh, we have a customer who bought 10 boats and from this city, well, maybe that's a smaller city than you realize, and it's going to become pretty clear pretty quickly who that person is. So, respect the business on both sides, the business side and the customer side. And then as far as who is pulling the data and overcoming the hurdle of getting access to brand data, I propose meeting in the middle. So I think it behooves business analysts at brands and companies to be empowered to think with a PR mindset. So if you are an agency, if you're a PR person, encourage data folks. Say, hey, you know this data better than anyone. You're spotting trends all day long for internal purposes. Let me know if you see something that's interesting from a PR front. Flag it for me. Let's talk about it, right? And if you're on the PR side, I think it's also very important to learn as much about the data analysts and the kind of processes that they go through as possible, so that you can respect their time, and you kind of have a better sense for which sort of request they can actually accommodate. And so, if you are a PR and you ask for, hey, I want to do this campaign around people born in different months, like what are their favorite whatever? Well, if your company doesn't have birth date data, then you're not going to be able to tell that story. And it's going to make you look a little silly if you ask the business analyst, hey, I want birthday data for every one of our customers. And similarly for business analysts, I think it's really important to help them feel empowered to help tell these stories, because they're the ones with the keys to the castle. They have access to the data. And I think they ought to feel empowered to contribute to PR. And at Vivid Seats, we have really good relationships on both sides of this. But I've also worked with other companies that are starting to see that, like, hey, let's break down some of those barriers internally between the people that are doing PR and the people that are analyzing data. And let's help the people that are analyzing the data understand the work that you're doing could also have a really big impact on our PR efforts. Because I think that's what you need for successful data storytelling. You need data and PR to come together. You can't have two completely separate operations. You need business and data analysts thinking like PRs, and you need PRs to become increasingly data savvy. So if you're a PR, what tools are your data folks using? Are you asking for a request that comes from Google Analytics or from your internal business intelligence tool? Start to know the sorts of requests that they can accommodate, the tools that they're using, talk their language as much as you can, and come together to help tell those data stories. And then ultimately, you can do everything right. You can respect customer privacy, business sensitivity. You can work with the data team. You think you have an interesting hook. But just like any other campaign, you need to tell a story with your data. So I thought this map was kind of funny. Most popular fast food chain by state. Yeah, it's McDonald's in every state. This is not interesting. At some point, somewhere, somebody thought, hey, it would be a cool story if we could look at fast food chain popularity by state. Well, it's an interesting thought, but the data produces something that just really isn't interesting. So at the end of the day, that's what you need to keep in mind is you can do everything right. You can use percentages, you can protect data sensitivity, but you still need to ultimately arrive at a story at an angle that is surprising, it's unexpected, that's sticky, something that you're excited to pitch. And so I've kind of broken it down into three things to take away. Advocate, calculate, celebrate. So advocate within your organization with your client about the role and the value of data storytelling. Get people involved. Get to know your data analysts. Share examples of successful internal data-led storytelling in different industries. Calculate the data and the opportunity. So calculate the data, get the data set, but really it's about, I think, calculating, is this a story that the company wants to tell, right? Like take off your PR blinders, think about a big picture. Is this going to in any way impact our business negatively? Is this going to upset some other arm of the business, right? Your PR win could become a loss pretty quickly if there's, some other side of the business that is negatively impacted by sharing your data. And then celebrate wins as wide as you can. So this gets back to the data and the PR folks converging. and along the lines of empowering your data folks to help flag ideas for stories. When you have wins, you want to celebrate them as widely as possible. So you want to know that you want them to know that this is not just a PR win, but this is a win for the entire company, and it would not have been possible without the help of our awesome data and business analysts who maybe have never done PR, maybe have never done a pitch, but they helped land coverage that we otherwise never would have gotten. So make sure they feel appreciated for their role in a PR process that is probably very unfamiliar to them. And so that's my presentation. I'm available on Twitter and email if anybody has any questions after this. And Giorgio, I'll hang around for questions on here.
Amazing. Thank you ever so much, Stephen. That was really insightful. I particularly resonated with your one of your final points there about no matter how good your data is, you always need that story, you need the angle. And I think, as we've seen in recent on recent occasions, even if you've got a sketchy methodology or perhaps the data is not quite where you want it to be, the story and the angle can ultimately get huge amounts of interest and get your story spread far and wide. So there's no questions in the chat just yet, but I had a couple of things that I was going to ask you myself, actually. And first off, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on overcoming kind of internal pushback or getting buy-in from senior stakeholders at a company to use internal data, even if it's not raw data or it's not anything that's identifiable for your customers or anything potentially that's going to give away a competitive advantage. I can imagine that there's still going to be some companies that are not too happy with using that data externally.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. And so we like to work with other companies who are progressive in sharing their data because we love kind of partnering up. Like if you're another brand, you have fun data. Is there a story that our two data sets can tell together in a way that no one else could kind of tell independently? So we talk to other companies on the data storytelling front, and some are very progressive and some are very traditional in like, hey, we don't share this data. This is not something we do. And I think it's, it gets back to like evangelizing and advocating. This is a very non-traditional way to do PR and way to do marketing in a lot of ways, right? So surveys and things have been used for a long time, but leveraging internal data is new and it's potentially scary. So it takes time. It takes conversation. I think it also takes like, hey, examples of these are really cool stories that other people are doing, and kind of showing like, hey, this is something that we could potentially also be doing. So it's not easy, and it takes, it's not going to happen overnight. If you're working for a company, I think that has never done any of this and is very skeptical of it, it may take a while, but I think it's about having conversations, being passionate about, there's a lot of opportunity here. We need to tap into it.
Totally. I think that show and tell element's really powerful as well. I mean, it's basic human psychology, right? Show me how somebody else is doing something great, and it's going to help convince me to give it a go as well. Had a question just come through on the chat. How can you find creative ways to connect data with current news if there's seemingly no connection to begin with? Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, so I think data is a very helpful way it's a very helpful angle on newsjacking. So if something big is happening in the news, I'm always wondering, is there some angle in our data that helps tell this story in a different way? And I think that's where like your creativity needs to come in. Is there a way that our data can tie into this story in a unique way to add something that is not currently being shared in this story? So Travis Scott had a big Fortnite concert a few months ago or early in 2020. And we had data that showed everybody was talking about Fortnite, Travis Scott. Well, it was interesting that people, after going to the Fortnite concert, were also then looking for Travis Scott tickets. Like it was, I guess, somewhat intuitive, but no one else was kind of piecing together the connection of people are enjoying a virtual concert in Fortnite, which is totally new. And then that's feeding this appetite to attend an in-person concert for Travis Scott. And so, yeah, I think it's like, timely angles and how can you tie your data potentially to a story that's already popular and giving it kind of a new lens and a new angle to understand a phenomenon that's already happening.
Yeah, it's very much that camera analogy you used earlier on in your deck of if you've got a certain aperture at the moment, how can you keep widening that and going outside the box and just try and keep pushing until you try and find something that fits with the story you're trying to tell.
And I do think that certain companies, certain brands, like I think there's opportunity for all brands, but I do think that certain companies, certain industries probably just have data sets that maybe lend themselves more to this sort of thing. Like if you're in an industry that, is very niche and very, doesn't get a lot of like news all the time, like it may be difficult to newsjack with a data angle. But I absolutely believe that all companies can benefit from it and, should be exploring ways to do it.
Absolutely. I would say, and I don't know whether this is something you agree with, Stephen, there comes a certain point where potentially you do need to step back and say, okay, this story doesn't really fit with our brand, with our data, with our angle. Because I think consumers, they're not stupid, and it's very easy for them to see when you're trying too hard to shoehorn something in.
Oh, of course. No, absolutely. And that's where it's like that relevance is kind of key. If your data is truly adding to the story and truly providing a new perspective, then it's obviously relevant. But if you're not doing that and it feels forced, then yeah, that first of all, it's not going to get picked up. It's not going to get included, and it would lead anyone thinking, well, what does ice cream sales data have to do with concert tickets, right? So totally agree with you.
It's a great way to get blacklisted in a journalist's inbox, right?
Yeah.
We've got another question from Cameron. Thanks, Cameron. Can you be too creative when presenting the data to journalists?
Can you be too creative in presenting the data to journalists? So I think like there's two kind of lanes that we've operated in. One is where we are building a campaign that is going to live and run on our own brand site, so a traditional campaign. And when we're doing that, we typically, value a creative visualization, kind of a beautiful experience, things like that. But then sort of the other side of it is like when we are working individually with data journalists, they don't care about that. They don't want to see a beautiful visualization because, there's probably someone at their newspaper that can do visualization 10 times better than we can. So they're not necessarily as interested in creative. I think they want an Excel file. They want to be able to dig into the data, understand the trend themselves, draw their own conclusions. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, like if it's a campaign that you're launching for a brand or an agency is launching for a brand, creative absolutely matters. If you are working kind of on a more one-off story where you're not launching a campaign, but you're providing data, maybe kind of a newsjacking opportunity, then I don't think creative is nearly as important as getting the Excel, getting the data in a timely fashion. So I hope that explained or answered your question, Cameron. But if not, feel free to tweet me later.
Yeah, that kind of feeds into the next question that came through as well from Verinia. I hope I've said your name correctly. Who asked about do we need to be creative in infographics and how you present data and way we visualize it? And I think that feeds indirectly to the point you've just made of it depends who you're reaching out to. One of the large outlets, and I imagine this is the big media players, they're going to, like you say, want the Excel file. They want the raw data because they can give it to the amazing teams they have internally that can produce these awesome visualizations, these interactive pieces. But for smaller publications or smaller outlets, surely you're going to want to present something yourself too. Yeah, and I think kind of on the visualization front, I think visualizing data has never been easier. So there are a lot of tools that we use that don't require intensive coding in order to tell kind of interesting, visualizations with the data. But I think you also just kind of need to understand your audience. And if you are pitching a publication that does world-class data visualization and graphics, I don't think they're going to be too impressed with, sort of your own visualization. They want the raw data to tell the story themselves. 100%. I think if you don't have internal capacity to create those design resources, either outsource it or trust the outlet to do it well themselves.
Yeah, and that's where an agency can be really, you know, kind of a helpful partner for a brand in designing those assets, visualizing the data. And frankly, like, I also think that, you know, the role of the agency is valuable as you begin to have those conversations with your data and your business analysts internally. You know, if you're a little shy, or if you're a little uncomfortable kind of stepping outside of the PR side of the business and going to your data folks and saying, hey, I want this data. Hey, I want that data. If you have an agency, you can sort of kind of transfer the ask to them. Well, sorry to bother you, but the agency, you know, ask for some data. That can be sort of a helpful crutch to begin breaking down some of those barriers between sort of the data analysts and the PR team.
Agencies are definitely, and this is obviously I'm biased, agencies are definitely a brilliant resource to bring on when you're working with data. And that feeds into the other question I was going to ask you actually, Stephen, which do you have any tips for people who are keen on becoming a data journalist if you don't have someone who's experienced in the analysis at your company?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think more brands are hiring data journalists, and I think it's a really great role for companies to have, because it blends those two sort of disciplines of like a storytelling mindset with the analytical chops of crunching data. I think SQL is a very good kind of skill set to begin learning if you really want to get comfortable pulling data, retrieving data. Obviously, Excel is a very, very powerful tool as well, so you can brush up on your Excel chops. And I would also just take the opportunity to follow data journalists on Twitter, understand, you know, kind of their world, the stories that they work on, and sort of immerse yourself in the world of a data journalist, because I think that will also help you tell better brand stories. You know, you're not going to do hard-hitting internal data revealing some super negative controversy at your brand, but you know, so journalist may be a little bit of a misnomer, but kind of brand storyteller with data. If you understand how data journalists work, I think that can really help you unearth some interesting stories, you know, with the help of skills like SQL, Excel, and business intelligence tools.
Absolutely. +1 from me for picking up SQL and chopping up on your Excel skills. Both are really, really easy to pick up and can go a huge way to helping you analyze data. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today. We're starting to run over a little bit, and I know people have plenty to be cracking on with. So yeah, if you do have any further questions for Stephen, you can reach out to him on Twitter or by email. I've left that up on the slides there, so make a note to get in touch. Otherwise, we have reached the end of today's session. So huge thank you to you, Stephen, for your presentation today. And obviously to you, our fabulous audience who have joined us again for another Sheffield DM. We're back again in 2 weeks' time, again online, where this time we're going to be joined by Gemma Fontaine, who is a freelance SEO consultant. And it's going to be quite a good one. She's going to be delivering some amazing tips on international SEO, specifically on multilingual keyword research. So that's a topic that I'm really keen to learn a bit more about. It should be an exciting one. The event page will be going up soon, so keep an eye out for that to register. As usual, if you have enjoyed Sheffield DM again today, you can give us some support and some love by hitting the thumbs up button underneath the video, like, subscribe, and please do follow us on Twitter at Sheffield DM or join our mailing list over at sheffielddm.co.uk, where you'll be able to get all the notifications about future events. And I promise next time we'll make sure daylight saving times doesn't muck things up and send the emails out an hour earlier than it was meant to. Also, if you are interested in speaking with us, do get in touch with me. We are booked up now until the end of May with a lot of really exciting speakers, but I'm always looking for new faces and new people that want to have a go at delivering something to our amazing audience here. You can reach out to me, hello@sheffielddm.co.uk, or find me on Twitter at Giorgio Casella. Stephen, is there anything else you'd like to shout out before we finish?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity. It was a lot of fun, something I'm really passionate about. And yeah, please feel free to ping me with any questions. Happy to help anyone who wants to kind of dig in a little deeper.
Amazing stuff. That's a very generous offer. Well, that's the close then. Thank you ever so much, everybody. And we will see you next time. Goodbye.